Ever feel like you're trying to navigate a huge ocean of information, just looking for those hidden treasures of knowledge? Well, you've definitely landed in the right place. Today, we're taking a deep dive into the profound ideas of G.S. Ghurye, a truly foundational figure in Indian sociology and anthropology.
Indeed, yeah. He's often hailed as the father of Indian sociology, and for very good reason. His groundbreaking ideas didn't just study Indian society, they fundamentally shaped how we understand its very structure, from the intricate caste system to its diverse tribal communities, and even the complex concept of national unity.
Right. So our mission today is to try and unravel his complex thoughts, pull out the most important concepts, and see how his historical insights continue to illuminate India's past and present. Get ready for some surprising facts and maybe some moments where everything just clicks into place. So, okay, let's unpack this. Who exactly was G.S. Ghurye? He wasn't just a scholar. One source vividly describes him as the commander on India's sociological frontiers. Think about this. He almost single-handedly laid the foundation for the entire first generation of Indian sociologists and anthropologists in the post-independence period. That's a massive legacy for one person, isn't it?
Absolutely, a huge influence. What made him so unique was his approach, really. He didn't just stick to one way of studying society. He brilliantly combined empirical methods, which means, directly observing society, seeing things as they are, almost like a scientist doing an experiment, with textual methods, which involves these deep dives into ancient writings and literature, much more like a historian.
Okay, so mixing observation with historical text.
Exactly. He was initially influenced by diffusionism from his time at Cambridge. That's the idea that cultural elements or practices, they sort of spread from one group or region to another. But what's truly fascinating is how his earlier education in Sanskrit and his deep knowledge of ancient Indian texts, what's called Orientalist thought, was equally powerful in shaping his views. This unique blend allowed him to even take the Aryan invasion theory, the idea that people called Aryans came to India from outside, and explain it through diffusionism, suggesting how their ideas and social structures might have spread.
What I find particularly compelling is Ghurye's unique approach to the caste system. He didn't just present it as inherently good or bad, like some simple judgment. Instead, he saw caste as this really complex, evolving cultural phenomenon, constantly changing over time. That challenges a lot of common assumptions, doesn't it?
It really does. His landmark work, Caste and Race in India from 1932, is a perfect example of this. In it, he takes us on an incredibly detailed journey, tracing caste from its earliest textual interpretations found in ancient Sanskrit literature all the way to its modern social reality, and crucially, how its function transformed over centuries. Ghurye believed that the sociology of India isn't static. It flows, from ancient India through medieval India and into modern India. This historical journey isn't just academic. It deeply informs how we understand the present.
Right. It underscores the importance of historical context.
Totally. It begs the question, how much can we really understand a social institution if we don't trace its full arc through time?
And what might genuinely surprise you is Ghurye's initial take on caste. He actually believed it was tied to race, coming to India with the Aryans, who initially distinguished themselves from non-Aryans based on color. But, and this is a crucial distinction he made, he argued that it wasn't initially a hierarchical or exploitative system. It's kind of unexpected.
Yeah, it is. He said Aryans never introduced themselves as Brahmins or some sort of superior race. Their society itself practiced different occupations, architects, peasants, warriors, artisans, and was highly disciplined and organized. Occupational change, he suggested, it was actually quite possible back then.
So not the rigid system we often think of.
Not initially, according to his reading. Ghurye emphasized that when Aryans and indigenous communities interacted, the disciplined nature of Aryan society was actually appreciated by local rulers. These rulers then incorporated elements of this caste-like system into their own social life. Plus, he said, priests, monasteries, even travelers helped spread what they saw as the virtues of this social system, causing the idea of caste to gradually spread or radiate from northern India to other parts of the country. So he traced its evolution from non-rigid or flexible to semi-rigid and eventually highly rigid throughout Indian history. It wasn't sudden.
Okay, so it really transformed over centuries. That makes sense. So how did Ghurye make sense of all this complexity? He didn't just describe it generally. He broke it down into 6 specific defining characteristics. Understanding these really helps you grasp his framework. Let's explore them.
Right. Think of these as the fundamental building blocks of the caste system, as Ghurye meticulously outlined them. First, the segmental division of society. This is like a compartmentalization, dividing the population into distinct, separate groups. It's horizontal, meaning groups are distinct, but not necessarily ranked, at least not initially. Membership is ascribed, you're born into it, and it passes down through generations. Each member has a fixed status, roles, tasks. Imagine society divided into separate rooms, and you're just born into one.
So it's about being born into a specific social box with predefined roles. That sounds pretty fundamental. Okay, what comes next?
Exactly. Second is hierarchy. This is where those segments get put into a pyramid structure. Certain cultural principles, like ideas of purity and pollution, determine a group's position, top to bottom. This vertical layering dictates who has access to what specific roles, responsibilities, even restrictive roles. For Ghurye, this implies a clear division of labor. Religious stuff for Brahmins, governance for Kshatriyas, business for Vaishyas, and menial jobs for Shudras. You can see how this layering impacts everything, right? From daily life to bigger opportunities like education or wealth.
Yeah, that immediately makes it much more rigid. And then we get to the actual restrictions.
Yes. Third is civil and religious disabilities and privileges. This really shows the system's rigidity in practice. Disabilities were restrictions or disadvantages, often for those considered impure or polluted castes, while privileges were advantages for higher pure castes. It's about who was allowed to do what or access what, purely based on their birth. Fourth, the lack of unrestricted choice of occupation. Occupations were largely fixed by heredity. People weren't generally allowed to change their traditional jobs. For example, upper castes, like Brahmins, had the freedom to study religious books, while lower castes were often assigned activities like sweeping, sometimes considered untouchable.
So your job was basically predetermined. That's a huge limitation.
Yeah.
What about just everyday social interactions?
Well, that leads us to the fifth point. Restriction on food, drinks, and social intercourse. There were strict rules about who could share food and drink. For instance, specific rules existed for kacha food, which is cooked food, and paka food, raw or specially prepared, dictating who could accept it from whom. And even rules about who you should keep a social distance from. Think about how limiting this would be in everyday life, not being able to share a meal with people just because of their family background.
Wow, that's intense. And the last one.
And finally, sixth, endogamy. This is a crucial one. People could only marry within their own caste. Disobeying this rule wasn't just seen as a crime, but also a sin. Traditional local caste councils, often called panchayats, could impose really severe punishments for intercaste marriages.
That's an incredibly structured way to understand caste. What's insightful about this framework is how it allowed Ghurye to show that caste wasn't monolithic, unchanging. It gives us a lens to see where and how it became rigid, rather than just that it was rigid. Now, what's fascinating is that Ghurye's analysis didn't stop there with historical caste. He then turned his attention to how modern forces, especially British colonial rule, reshaped these structures. And this often challenges some common assumptions about how caste changed over time.
He was very much aware of what the scholar Bernard S. Cohn called the objectifying power of the census, a powerful phrase. Ghurye believed that rather than just passively collecting data, the Indian census, by its very method, its categories, actually created a new sense of category identity. People started thinking of themselves more strongly in those terms.
So the act of counting and labeling changed things.
That was his argument. Ghurye was perhaps the first scholar to really condemn the caste census for leading to the emergence of caste associations, groups, organizing around caste identity and a sort of livening up of the caste spirit, which he thought resulted in more competition and conflict. Louis Dumont later picked up on this idea, calling it the substantialization of caste identities under modernity, meaning these identities became more fixed, concrete, more real in people's minds because of these processes.
Right, and Ghurye argued that this colonial pigeonhole method, forcing people into neat, labeled categories, actually led to the crystallization of the caste system. He believed it was actually quite fluid under indigenous rule before the British. He thought that initially caste was more about occupation, a functional group, but it was only with colonial rule that the idea of caste as exploitative and creating rigid inequalities became much more stringent. He even pointed to Sir Herbert Risley's 1901 census as the moment it was formally applied to the entire Hindu population, defining divisions in a way they hadn't been before, officially.
Yeah, and Ghurye even observed that many Indians were actually refusing to state their caste in the 1921 census. He interpreted that as a sign that they were actively trying to abandon caste altogether. He concluded that the whole idea of occupational castes was, in his words, purely manufactured and preserved by British census. He went further, arguing that the British insistence on classification and their early forms of affirmative action, like quota representation for lower castes, were, ironically, curing the problem that British themselves were creating.
So he saw it as reinforcing the divisions.
That was his view. This led to a huge increase in caste associations aiming to change their status in the hierarchy. You had Aboriginal groups seeking classification as Hindus, Kolas claiming to be Koli Rajputs, things like that. It's interesting to consider, isn't it? How do government interventions, even well-intentioned ones, sometimes have unintended long-term consequences on social structures? Ghurye personally believed caste would wither away, basically disappear, unless it was continuously reinvigorated by things like the census, certain Brahmanic writings, or government intervention like quotas. He actually rejected the occasional British policy of affirmative action. He argued that classic liberal policies of open schools and free competition would break down the walls of hierarchy faster than quotas and targets would.
Okay, moving from caste then. Ghurye also deeply explored the complex relationship between tribal communities and mainstream Hindu society. This led to a very famous debate that really highlights different ways of thinking about cultural integration.
That's right. Ghurye believed that multiple ethnic groups were present in India before the Aryans even arrived. He argued that Hindu culture wasn't just imposed on tribal communities from the outside. Rather, he saw Hinduism itself as evolving from a dynamic interaction between Aryan culture, which he viewed as mystical and spiritual, and the more tantric, magical, and materialistic cultures of different existing ethnic groups. So, tribal deities like Ganesh, Kali, and Shiva, and tribal religions like animism, totemism, naturalism all found equal space within Hinduism alongside Aryan deities like Indra, Vishnu, and Brahma.
So kind of merging?
Emerging, or perhaps an absorption. As a result, Ghurye believed that the tribes of India voluntarily assimilated themselves within the folds of Hindu society, seeing it as a new home. He pointed out that many tribal leaders even successfully introduced Hindu cultural attributes into tribal life, leading to what's been called the Hinduization of tribes in the heartland of the country.
This brings us to the famous Elwyn-Ghurye debate. Verrier Elwyn, who was a British administrator and anthropologist, he championed an isolationist or protectionist policy. He believed Indian tribes were culturally distinct and their way of life should be preserved through state-enforced isolation from Hindu society, essentially keeping them separate. What was Ghurye's reaction to that?
Ghurye was highly critical of this isolationism. He argued that forced isolation would actually accelerate suspicion and potentially lead to secessionist movements groups seeking to separate from the main country. He cited separatist movements in northeast India as perhaps a product of emphasizing cultural distinction between tribes and the larger Hindu society, implying Elwyn's approach could make things worse. He saw his own view as a nationalist approach focused on unity. Instead of distinct cultural groups, Ghurye contested the whole tribe-caste distinction itself. He designated tribes as imperfectly integrated classes of Hindu society, or even backward Hindus. Now, we need to be careful with that term backward. He used it not in a derogatory sense, but because he felt that while they had adopted many Hindu life practices and rituals, the deeper philosophical understanding, the complex tenets of Hinduism, like sanskar or Buddhi concepts about values, intellect hadn't fully reached them. They still retained more of their tribal beliefs.
I see. So it was about the depth of assimilation in his view.
Exactly. Ghurye also believed Hinduization actually improved the economic situation of tribal people by allowing them to move beyond traditional tribal crafts and adopt specialized occupations that were more in demand. And he further argued that any exploitation or cultural degradation tribals faced wasn't because of contact with Hindus, but due to the economic and legal changes brought by colonial rule itself. It really makes us wonder, doesn't it? When a society tries to support a community, is it truly better to preserve its distinctness through isolation or to encourage integration into a larger society? It's a fundamental question, no easy answers.
Definitely something to think about. Finally, Ghurye was deeply concerned with what he called vociferous tendencies in the country, basically, forces that could tear India apart. And he saw an urgent need for national integration. This was a huge part of his later work. And it's important to understand his perspective here. Just to be clear, we're simply reporting on Ghurye's views as found in the source material, not endorsing any particular viewpoint ourselves.
Right. For Ghurye, national integration was fundamentally based on social integration. This meant having shared values and, crucially, an emotional identification of individuals with the ideal totality represented by the nation-state. He openly stated he had no faith in the official ideology of secularism, promoted by leaders like Nehru at the time, or the idea that a composite or plural nation could be politically created just by declaring it so. He felt the failure of secularist theory, in his view, was demonstrated by continuous communal riots and demands for separate states.
So he was quite critical of the state's approach then.
Very. He was openly opposed to what he termed the appeasement of minorities in the name of secularism. He implied that religion, specifically Hinduism, was the core basis of national unity, a unity he believed was broken historically by the Islamic invasion. He saw Muslims as generally keeping themselves apart from Hindus, posing a major challenge to India's integration in his analysis. What's particularly notable here, though, is that while he was critical of Muslims, he condemned any group attempting to assert a separate identity, including Adivasis, Dalits, and proponents of other caste-based movements, because he believed these actions threatened the overall unity of India.
Ghurye's views on national integration, particularly his critique of secularism and policies for minorities, were certainly provocative and remain so. Can you elaborate a bit on what specific threats he believed undermined India's cohesion?
Sure. He identified several key areas that he felt were problematic. First, he criticized the policies of the ruling party. He saw policies offering special privileges to religious minorities, numerically strong Hindu backward classes, and scheduled castes as basically attempts at winning votes, not genuine social reform.
Okay, so political motivation in his view.
That was his argument. Second, he was against reservations. In his book, Whither India, he specifically criticized reservation policies for scheduled castes and scheduled tribes, viewing them as perpetuating division rather than overcoming it. Third, He strongly attacked the census and caste associations again. He felt Risley's census work actively promoted the consolidation of caste identities and fueled the emergence of caste associations.
Right, linking back to his earlier point about the census.
Exactly. He believed government policies were unintentionally producing divisive caste politics. He opposed social movements of backward classes because he thought they perpetuated caste distinctions instead of promoting assimilation into mainstream Hindu society. He even said these caste associations increased caste consciousness and strengthened the community aspect of caste, creating what he called a vicious circle of caste patriotism.
So he saw well-intentioned policies as potentially reinforcing the very divisions they aimed to overcome. That's a powerful critique.
Yay.
What else did he identify as threats?
Well, he pointed to separatism and particularism, seeing the partition of India as the terrible culmination of these tendencies, with Hindu-Muslim conflicts being a persistent issue in his historical view. He also criticized Dravidian party politics in the South for their strong anti-Hindi sentiments, and what he saw as indifference to Northern Sanskrit literature, which he considered part of a shared national heritage. And he was concerned by various linguistic tensions like anti-Hindi feelings, Assamese-Bengali conflict, Urdu protagonism, anything creating language-based divisions. Finally, he viewed anti-Brahmin movements and backward class movements as problematic for integration. He saw these attacks on the traditional hierarchy as generating new kinds of collective sentiment and feelings of caste solidarity, which he felt worked against broader unity. M.N. Srinivas, another sociologist, expanded on this later, calling it horizontal consolidation, how modern tech like printing, post, railways allowed caste leaders from different areas to connect, discuss common problems, even form caste journals and conferences, strengthening those specific identities.
It sounds like Ghurye tended to maybe idealize the past a bit, believing that modern competition had replaced an old harmony and this caste solidarity had taken the place of the traditional village community ideal.
You could certainly interpret it that way, yeah. His ultimate belief was that national integration and the remedy for things like untouchability should be achieved by the absorption of diverse religious and backward groups into mainstream Hindu society. Which leaves us with a significant thought. Thinking about Ghurye's vision, how do different ideologies attempt to achieve national unity in a truly diverse nation like India, and what are the inherent challenges when those ideologies clash?
That was a lot to unpack, but hopefully you now have a far deeper understanding of G.S. Ghurye and his enduring legacy. Let's quickly recap the key ideas for your memory bank.
Okay, yeah. So we discussed Ghurye's foundational role, the father of Indian sociology, and his unique blend of empirical observational methods and textual historical ones. We explored his nuanced historical view of caste, noting its evolution, as he saw it, from potentially non-hierarchical and occupational to very rigid, and those 6 characteristics he identified: segmental divisions, hierarchy, restrictions, occupation, social intercourse limits, and endogamy.
Right, the 6 pillars.
Exactly. Then we delved into his controversial critique that British census policies inadvertently strengthen caste divisions rather than diminishing them, and how he preferred liberal policies over affirmative action. And finally, we covered his strong assimilationist stance on tribes, viewing them as backward Hindus rather than distinct groups, contrasting with Elwyn's isolationism, and how he saw integration as crucial for broader national unity. His deep concern for national integration emphasized shared culture values, particularly Hinduism in his view, as paramount, and he critically viewed policies or movements that he felt fostered divisive tendencies.
That was a truly insightful deep dive into the mind of G.S. Ghurye. His ideas, even decades later, really continue to provoke thought and discussion about identity, social structure, and national unity in India.
Indeed. And maybe this raises a final question for listeners to consider. How do historical interpretations of social structures like Ghurye's continue to shape contemporary debates about identity, policy, and national cohesion in diverse societies like India today?
Something to mull over as you go about your day. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.